Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about speech act theory. An introduction to speech act theory. The information is gathered from Speech Act Theory presentation by Peter Fogg and from Huda et al. 2019, a pragmatic analysis of speech acts in short surahs of the Holy Quran. And actually, I depend mostly on Peter Fogg presentation. And this is the cover page for his presentation. And this is the cover page for Huda et al. Paper. Now, for the first time, we have to talk about what is a speech acts theory. A speech act theory is based on communication, examining how people communicate, and recognizing that there is more communication than simply information transfer. It also recognizes that words often do things besides simply inform or convey information. Some examples of speech acts theory taken from everyday life will include, for example, performing a wedding. When the chaplain says, "I now pronounce you a husband and a wife," the chaplain is not communicating information to the new couple, but they will understand that these words will change their situation. And now they are, in the eyes of God and others, they are a husband and a wife. Of course, it is no matter who says these words, but it should be said in the right context where these words are uttered in order to properly interpret it. A second example of speech acts might be a blessing. When someone says, "May the Lord bless you and keep you." In such an utterance, it is clear that the author is not simply converting information because his words stood against that, and that he doesn't say God is blessing you or will bless you and keep you. And here he expresses a desire that something might happen. Some other authors go further to say that the author, when saying this, he is not only expressing desire, but rather he tries to seek and bring about some kind of transformation in the recipient. That is, when someone is giving a blessing, he or she is doing it in order to bring about a positive feeling in the part of the recipient and actually do something in that, not simply to communicate information. Another example of speech acts is declaration of faith. Let's look or think of the statement, "Jesus is Lord." For the first glance, this might appear as an information transfer because this is a fact that Jesus is a Lord. We accept that. But also something more is going on than simply a statement of fact. Because many times, even today, when we say Jesus is Lord, we recognize that the word does not look like Jesus is Lord. The word is in oftentimes open rebellion to the idea of Jesus' lordship. So to make a declaration that says Jesus is Lord, it is not just to communicate a truth, because it's true that Jesus is Lord, but is also to communicate or to make a statement of faith. It is bolstering the faith of both the speaker, perhaps, and also the listener. It might be persuasive to persuade someone to accept the fact that Jesus is Lord, even in the face of a situation where it does not doesn't look like Jesus is Lord. Well, these are all examples of speech acts where something more is going on than simply information transfer. The writer Kevin Van Hooser, 2002, says, "Interpretation is the process of inferring authorial intention and ascribing allocutionary acts. It seems clearly here that there is a relationship between authorial intentions, allocutionary acts, and interpretation. You are hopefully aware of the idea that authorial intention is an important aspect of interpretation, and that is where meaning lies. It is in the author's intended meaning. What Van Hooser is saying is that part of that interpretation is to understand what actually is going on with the words being spoken in those instances where there is a discrepancy or disconnect between the words spoken and their appearances, and what is actually happening with them. Speech act theory is very closely associated with two landmark works. The first is called How to Do Things with Words by J.L. Austin. Not only set stage for speech act theory, but it was advanced very significantly by the second work of his student, Cyril, later on. Jane Austen inspired a speech acts theory in which language is perceived as being a tool by which we can do things. Speech acts refers to a theory which analyzes the role of utterances in relation to the behavior of speaker and hearer in interpersonal communication. Austen introduced his notion on this theory in lectures in 1955, and then they were published in 1962 under the title How to Do Things with Words. In the course of time, John R. Cyril, in 1969, who was Austen's student, modified and developed this theory. Now, returning back to Austen, in this theory, Austen distinguished between two types of utterances: constatives and performatives. Constatives are utterances that are assessed according to whether they are true or false, whereas performatives are utterances that are assessed according to whether they are felicitous or not. The following examples explain the difference between the two. We went down to Como. This sentence is constative if it is said as a statement that can be assessed as true or false. The second example, I give and bequeath my watch to my brother. Since there is an action of bequeathing, this sentence is performative. He is performing something. Later, Austen has rejected the constative performative distinction and favored a general theory of speech acts, in which both performatives and constatives are considered special subcases. In this respect, he concludes that both constatives and performatives are subject to felicity conditions, in which I'm going to explain later on. And sometimes constatives and performatives cannot be distinguished even in terms of truth or felicity. Now, Austen made a distinction, another distinction between explicit performatives and implicit performatives or primary performatives. Explicit performatives are utterances that are performed by the use of performative verbs. Fromkin et al. 1996 state that performative verbs are verbs by which we do things and which make the allocutionary force explicit. On the other hand, implicit performatives are speech acts that are achieved without the use of performative verbs. According to Austen, there are three types of action or acts that are constituted by the same utterance simultaneously. These acts are as follows: allocutionary act, the act in which a string of sounds or words are produced to create a meaningful linguistic expression. Let's take this example. In a classroom setting, when a professor ends the class and says, "That's enough for today, class," the locutionary act here is the professor literally saying, "That is enough for today, class." The second act, an illocutionary act, the act performed when the utterance is produced by a speaker to communicate his intention to a hearer. An illocutionary act is referred to as a speech act in its narrow sense because it is the heart of speech acts theory. For example, when John says to Mary, "Please pass me the glasses," an illocutionary act of ordering or requesting is performed. Such an act is also referred to as the illocutionary force or the illocutionary point of the speech act. The illocutionary force is also referred to as a pragmatic function. Al-Sayadi, 2016, based on Cyril, 1969, and Baker, 2011, defines the pragmatic function as, and this is a quotation, "The illocutionary force a given speech act entails in addition to the meaning it expresses, and it refers to the embedded associative connotations of a word or an expression that carries implicit meaning." Again, this is a quotation for Al-Sayadi. Take back to the example of the professor. When the professor says, "That's enough for today, class," the intended effect on the listener is how the professor says it or conveys it, with angry tone, angry pitch, attitude, feeling, and body language, or with a happy tone and pitch, attitude, feeling, and body language. Which type of tone the speaker uses to affect the hearer. The third act is a polylocutionary act. The act constituted when a speaker produces an utterance to make an effect on a hearer. Actually, when speaking, all the three acts mentioned above are used or performed by the speaker at the same time. But we make the distinction here between them is only for an analytic purpose. In addition, the previously mentioned distinctions helped Austin to inspire a model consisting of 5 classes of speech acts. His model is developed by his student Cyril later on. Let's return back to the example of the professor. Depending on how the professor says or conveys, "That's enough for today, class," let's take the angry tone of this. Angry tone, angry mood, and also this reflects the body language. The students' reactions to the angry tone could be inferred by the students as the teacher or the professor is now upset because of their bad performance inside the class, and this makes the professor very angry, and then he wants them to get out immediately without talking to him at all. Now, their speech acts usually depend on some velocity conditions. In other words, for an act to be performed correctly, there are certain conditions that an act should match. And Austin mentions 6 velocity conditions. I'm not going to dig deep on these 6 velocity conditions because this will require me to have 2 lectures instead. But I'm going to shed light on them on the surface. I'm going to give summary for these 6 types of velocity conditions. Actually, there are 6. They are pairs A, B, C, A1, A2, B1, B2, and C1, C2, and each 2, for example, A2 has a relation with 1, B2 has a relation with B1, and C2 has a relation with C1. So let's have a look on them, on these 6 velocity conditions. The first one, A1, there must exist an accepted conventional procedure having a certain conventional effect. So there should exist an accepted conventional procedure, and this accepted conventional procedure should have a certain conventional effect. This procedure should include uttering certain words in certain circumstances that are performed by particular people. Now, let's come to the second one, A2. These particular people and circumstances must be appropriate for the invocation of that particular procedure. Now, for B1, the procedure must be executed by all participants correctly. And B2, the procedures must be executed by all the participants completely. C1, the procedure is designed by people having certain thoughts and feelings. So any person participating must have those thoughts and feelings, and the participants must intend to do so to conduct themselves. And finally, C2, they must actually conduct themselves subsequently. The other landmark work is taken from Speech Acts and Essay in the Philosophy of Language by John R. Searle. And in fact, it is Searle who built on the work of Austin and really refined a nuance, new ideas that Austin was raising about what speech acts are and how they function and how they are helpful in understanding the communicative events. To maintain, Searle again states that there are 3 components. He is emphasizing here the same Austin's component, 3 components of a speech acts theory. We have the locution, what is actually said. There is the allocution, what is actually meant by the said. And then there is the perlocution, which is how a listener responds. So the locution is what is actually said by a speaker. And it is important that the locutions can take any number of forms. They can be a statement or a question. Also is of grammatical variations in terms of what is being said. So these are the words that are spoken. The allocution, though, is what is verbally accomplished by what is said. Maybe we have taken this, taken it as to know that allocution is what the locution really is. That is, it is doing something perhaps different from what it appears. And this is really the heart of speech acts theory. The idea there is allocution, allocutionary effect, or there is allocution as opposed to the locution, or that potentially opposed to the locution at least. Actually, there are several types of allocutions, and they are depending on which commentator you are looking at to be characterized differently. But we will take a look at these 5 types of allocutions as associated with the work of Searle. The first one is assertive. An assertive is as simply as a statement about how things are. This might be information transfer in a kind of utterance. Utterance, by the way, is a speech act, terms for a type of speech. And we'll talk about utterances as a written text as well. And that certainly works in terms of this because the same principles apply even to written text. But an assertive as a type of allocution is a statement as how things are. How things are. They might be on the type of information transfer. Now we will move to the second one. Directives. Second one is directives. In the directive, the speaker is trying to get someone to do something else. And that might be through the giving of commands, through persuasive speech, through invitations, and through a number of things. But the idea is that the speaker is trying to get someone to do something he or she wanted to do. Then we will move to the third type, commissives. In commissives, the speaker commits himself to doing something and does so by that utterance. For example, I promise to do this. I promise to do this is a commissive. It is not simply an information transfer. It is actually doing something, that committing someone to do something. And then we come to the expressives. Expressives are utterances in which a speaker expresses his feelings, his attitudes, shares what the feelings and attitudes might be. And then we have declarations. And these are the kinds of utterances. This is very much important, declarations, because they are the kind of utterances that actually bring about changes through the utterances. And we saw the example of wedding. I now pronounce you a husband and a wife. That is declarative type of allocution, where the reality has changed simply because the situation is changed now with the couple, and now they are a married couple in the eyes of God and others. So this is a declaration there. Now, the third type is of speech act theory is perlocution, where the hearer does a response, what the hearer does in response to the utterance. So how the listener behaves, how he responds, what does he do in response to the utterance is really the perlocution. And there is also a fourth category called precautionary intention, which means what a speaker intends for the listener to do in response to the utterance. This component is not always included in the components of speech act theory. Scholars investigating speech act theory are divided as whether or not precautionary intention should be considered as part of the theory. And Peter Falk is with the idea that it should be. This is also my idea too. The reason for that is that precautionary intention refers to what a speaker intends for the listener to do in response to the utterance. That is, when speakers speak or write, they have certain desire to respond. They are not giving information transfer. They are trying to do something. And they have a desired response on the part of the listener. And that desired response certainly shapes the way in which the utterances are shaped. And so what a speaker intends for the listener to do in response to the utterance, I think, is a legitimate part of an examination of the entire speech act. Now, I think it will be helpful if we take out an example here. Actually, there are a couple of examples. One is from everyday life use, and the other, I took it from the Quran, while Peter Falk took it from the Bible. Let's start with everyday example, because I think it is helpful to us to recognize that this goes on all the time. Whether you've ever heard of speech act theory or not, you will have grasp of how it will work, because you will be able to function effectively in everyday society We're surrounded by speech acts and use speech acts consistently and frequently in our lives. So we are going to look to a couple of examples to help us to understand better what is going on with speech acts. The writer of this essay is speaking here about his own experience. So he said, when he was an officer in a destroyer ship, he said, "It is very common to hear the announcement from a loudspeaker addressing the officers and soldiers there. So one day there was an announcement, says, 'Lieutenant Fogg, please dial 613. After a short time working on a ship, and the speech is to Peter Fogg, of course, he said, I learned that 613 is the number of the captain of the ship, the commander officer. So as a good obedient Navy officer, when I heard that announcement says that I have to dial 613, I directly dialed that number and my captain would answer the phone. The captain might say, to me after picking up the phone, 'Lieutenant Fogg, would you please come to my office?' And again, as a good Navy officer, my response to this utterance would be, 'Aye, aye, Captain.' Now, we all can understand if you have been in a military area or you might have been in, you have seen in a TV or in films, for instance, such a response could be expected or would be expected. This is what to expect really. But why this is what to expect? The utterance, 'Lieutenant Fogg, would you please come to my office?' And the response, 'Aye, aye, Captain,' makes sense together in such circumstances. But let's look to possible other response that might be given and why that does or doesn't work. Concerning the captain's utterance, 'Lieutenant Fogg, would you please come to my office?' It will be inappropriate if I respond by saying, 'No thanks, Captain. I'm a bit busy right now.' But why it is inappropriate to give such a response? Though the utterance is an invitation, 'Would you please come to my office?' And if it is an invitation, then my response, 'No thanks, Captain. I'm a bit busy right now,' would be an appropriate response to this utterance. But we can possibly understand just in that level that it is not an invitation or request, and that it is inappropriate to answer by 'No thanks, Captain,' because of the situation I am in. And of course, the speech is for Peter Fogg. He says, certainly I wouldn't do that. Now, let's have a look from the stage of speech acts theory and see if we can understand why this would be appropriate or inappropriate response and what actually going on in the communication between my captain and me. Once we look to this utterance from a speech act theory, we note that the locution, what is actually said by the speaker, and of course this is the utterance of my officer to me, 'Lieutenant Fogg, would you please come to my office?' Now, the locution, as we counter it, is in the form of a question, and we can recognize it by the question mark at the end of the utterance, which would suggest that it is a request or an invitation. And as we said, that what it looks to be. But the elocution, as we've already known, what is verbally accomplished by what is said, what is the utterance actually doing, is not actually asking a question. It looks like as if it is a request, or an invitation. But what is really happening is that the captain is giving order. So the allocutionary effect of his utterance is that he is giving me an order. Of course, he would have said it like, Lieutenant Fogg, come to my office, directly, like that. And then the locution and the allocution will match. But he chooses for one reason or another to say the order in the form of a question. Well, some of this depends on context, because it is an axiom in military that the request from senior officers is turned out to an order. So, and still the speech is for the writer of this information. So I know that according to my experience working in military ships, and according to the shared knowledge that we both have, and what I really understand, that this is not a request, and that I have obeyed the order, because it is not a request and not an invitation either. It is in fact an order. So this is what actually going on, and that people understand the situation and the context, and that the answer no thanks would be inappropriate at all. Just to put in mind that he is the captain of this mission, and according to the context, as being in a high rank, a high level, and superior in position, it will be inappropriate to say no. Now, suppose I misunderstand this utterance, which means that I misunderstand the allocutionary effect. It means I'm gonna lose a felicitous speech act, a happy speech act. A happy speech act is one when the listener understands the allocution. Then miscommunication will happen instead. Now, the perlocution, which, as I said, what the hearer does in response to the utterance, aye, Captain. This is my response, and presumably go to my captain's statement. So that the listener's response to the utterance is the perlocution. Then, the fourth aspect is the perlocutionary intention, what a speaker intends for the listener to do in response to the utterance. And in this situation, what the speaker, my captain, intends for the listener to do is to say, aye, Captain, and then actually come. And this is where the perlocutionary intention happens. I think it is a helpful contribution to speech act theory, because it reminds us that when my captain says, Lieutenant Fogg, would you please come to my office? He has an interest in the response. He is not just throwing a request out there, or throwing information there, or doing something alike, but rather he has something he wants me to do in response. Now, we can see how things works further by looking to another example, or perhaps shifting the example slightly. Now, when I was on the ship, I had working for me a chief period officer. And the chief period officer in a navy is a sergeant in other services. The chief period officer worked with me, and normally the chiefs on the ship would live together in an area in the ship known as chief's mess. So one day, my chief period officer called me through the FCC, and here I wrote down to you what is the meaning of FCC, and said, Lieutenant Fogg, would you please come to the chief mess? Now, in response to that utterance, I might say to my chief, no thanks, chief, I'm a bit busy right now. Now, the question is this a legitimate response? And we can all reasonably recognize that it will be a legitimate response to the utterance there. Now, why it is a legitimate response in this example, why it is not in the previous one? Why it is accepted here, while it is not accepted in the previous example? This is because in this instance, the locution is in the form of invitation or request, and that's also the perlocutionary effect. That is also, the allocution is a request or an invitation. But why I consider it as a request or invitation, an invitation, and I didn't consider it in the previous example as a request or an invitation? This is because my chief is not higher rank than I am. And so it is not the case that a request from a junior person tends to be an order. That only works the other way around. That the request from a senior always tends to turn into order. So because we have the same rank, the same nature of communication, we have the same situation and the context, this would make the locution matches the allocution and then get the perlocution. And that what I've heard from my chief period officer is really a request. Now, if we think of different types of allocutions, we talked about before about these types. They are here in front of you. We can see that we are dealing in these two examples. We are dealing with directives. In both examples, whether the captain is speaking or the chief is speaking, the purpose of the speech is to get the listeners to do something. Now, in the case of the captain, the directive is much stronger than in the case of the chief. In the case of the chief, it is a request. It is an invitation. While in the case of the captain, it is an order. But either way, it is a directive. And it is trying to get the listener to do something different. We can see that it is not an assertive. It is not an assertive. Because it is not saying the way things are, and it is not commissive either. It is not commissive either, where the speaker commits himself to do something. I might make a commissive and say, for example, if I say to my chief, "No thanks, chief, I'm a bit busy right now, but I'll be there at 5 o'clock." That would be a commissive, since I commit myself to do something at that point. However, the utterances that we produce then are directives. We can see that they are not expressive either. So they are not expressives, and they are not declarations also, according to the definitions that we are given. Now let's have another example. If we look to the following statement, it's called outside. I hope we can see that this can actually function at least in 4 different ways. Maybe you can think of other ways they can or could be functioning. But it could function as an assertive. Simply a statement about how things are. I might walk in from a cold and I might say to someone, "It's cold outside." It is simply that I say the way that it is. It might be a response also to a question. How cold is it? It's cold outside. And this is simply an assertive. Talking to someone the way a thing is. It could also function as a directive. For example, I have several children, and when I'm helping them get ready to school, they might ask me, "Can we wear our light jackets? Can we wear our light jackets?" I respond, and I might say to them, "It's cold outside." Well, if you look from the surface, my response is not an answer to my children's question, because it seems clearly that the answer is not matching the question. But in reality, what I'm doing in the communicative situation there is that I'm really answering their question according to the context. Here again, the response is based on the positional authority. I'm actually given a directive. When my children asked me, can we wear light jackets? And I respond, it's cold outside. They understand, or hopefully they will understand, that what I'm telling them is that not to wear the light jackets, but rather the heavy ones, because it is cold outside there. So the utterance looks like simply as a statement, but it is actually a directive. Things can function differently or in a different way, as you know. It could be a commissive, where the speaker commits himself to doing something. If a man is going outside to do something, and perhaps his wife is interested in him coming in quickly because they have many things inside the house to accomplish, she might say, don't take too long outside. That man might respond by saying, it's cold outside, I won't stay long. In a hint that he doesn't have the intention of being long outside and committing himself to come in a reasonable time. So the utterance, it's called outside, actually, then is a commissive. Finally, the same expression, it's called outside, could be an expressive, when we express our feelings and attitudes in terms of situations. So if I'm in the middle of winter and the cold temperature is below 0, and I'm fed up with it and I'm tired, I might just say, it's cold outside. Here I'm trying to convey, I'm not trying to convey any information. Rather, I'm trying to communicate my feelings that I'm unhappy because it is cold outside. The one type of allocutionary utterance that does not work here is declarative. And that, for me to say it is cold outside, I'm not changing the reality. It is not cold because I said so. As you see in the case of I pronounce you a husband and a wife, these utterances change the reality, and instead of being single, now they are a married couple. So the utterance changes the reality. But if I said it is cold outside, I'm not changing the reality. It is not cold because I said so. So since my utterance doesn't affect reality, then this utterance is not declarative at all. Now let's have another example from the Quran. فَإِذَا فَرِغْتَ فَانْصِبْ. The moment you are freed of one task, work on. The expression فَإِذَا فَرِغْتَ فَانْصِبْ means if you, Prophet Muhammad, are free from your duties, exert yourself in invocation or supererogatory prayers. In this verse, Allah orders the Prophet Muhammad to exert the supplication of him after performing prayers as a gratitude to him for his bounties, like soothing his heart, felicitating the burden of the message, etc. Based on Cyril 1969, there is no contrast between the structure and the function of the utterance above. And it is not merely a statement Allah says to say it to the Prophet, or it is not information transfer. Allah also does not commit himself to anything, and he is not expressing feelings. It seems clearly that it is an instance of direct speech act or direct speech acts of directive of ordering pragmatic function. So mentioning direct speech acts, this will let us come to what is known as direct and indirect speech acts. People prefer to use indirectness when communicating with others because it has a relationship to politeness. It helps avoid giving unpleasant messages to the recipients. Bach and Harnisch, 1979, mentioned that sometimes when performing a speech act, what is meant is more than what is said. And in this case, an indirect speech acts occur. Indirect speech acts are acts that occur when there is an indirect relationship between a structure and a function. Direct speech acts are acts that occur when there is a direct relationship between a structure and a function. Searle introduces the notion of primary and secondary illocutionary act. The primary illocutionary act is the indirect one, and the secondary illocutionary act is the direct one. In order for the speaker to successfully perform the indirect speech act, and in order for the hearer to understand both primary and secondary illocutionary acts at once, they need shared knowledge. In addition, the hearer must be able to infer what the speaker means. Searle provides an example of primary and secondary illocutionary acts. Student X, let's go to the movies tonight. Student Y, I have to study for an exam. In sentence 1, X makes a proposal of going to the cinema, and in sentence 2, Y rejects this proposal. X understands from Y's statement that he or she is unable to go tonight. Y's statement is called the secondary illocutionary act. Please pay attention. I'm saying that Y's statement is called the secondary illocutionary act, and Y's rejection is the primary illocutionary act. We reach here to the end of the lecture. I hope you benefit and understand what is meant by speech act theory from both Austin and Searle. Thanks a lot for your attention and concern, and goodbye.